Let's get straight to the point. Why has Russia done what it has done in the last 4 or 5 days? Why has Russia attacked Ukraine? Is Russia justified? Absolutely. To debunk the Western propaganda, which is as usual based on deception, lies, nonsense, and hypocrisy and double standards, just look at this map that is in front of you. NATO has been aggressively expanding towards the borders of Russia since 1997. 14 countries have been added to NATO. And Russia had made it very clear that Russia will not accept a Ukraine which is member of NATO. Because if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, NATO will deploy offensive, strategic, and non-strategic, i.e. conventional weapons in Ukraine, which will pose a direct and imminent threat to Russia, which for Russia was a red line which cannot be crossed. Russia, for the last many months, made a lot of offers to discuss new security arrangements in Europe, which were ignored. Ukraine not only wanted immediate NATO membership, but Ukraine also spoke about seeking nuclear weapons in the future. So that was it. When Russia realized that US and NATO are not going to stop, Russia had to do what it had to do. Russia has gone in, and let us be very clear. What are the strategic objectives of this mission? Russia does not want to occupy Ukraine. And that is very clear. If you look at all the statements and if you look at the number of personnel being used in these operations, it's very clear that this is a limited operation which is not aimed at occupying Ukraine, but disarming Ukraine, and to send a clear message to the West that enough is enough. Let's look at another map. This is even more graphic of how NATO has expanded in the last 2 decades. And if somebody says that NATO is not a threat to Russia, let them answer my simple question. NATO was created in the days of the Cold War. NATO was created because there was a Soviet threat. When Soviet Union collapsed, why wasn't NATO disbanded? I will tell you why. Because the US and NATO decided that Russia is the new enemy. And therefore, not only did NATO continue to exist, but started aggressively expanding towards the east. Fast forward to today, Russian forces are now operating inside Ukraine. And for those who think that Russian onslaught is not going well, let them see for themselves that the capital, Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, is pretty much here, which is pretty far from Russia. Initially, Russian operations were limited to this area. And if their forces have reached this area of Ukraine within 5 days, it tells you a lot. Please also bear in mind that Russia wishes to avoid civilian casualties because there are many pro-Russian loyalists living in this country. And therefore, Russia cannot do what US does. Russia cannot do carpet bombing the way US did in Iraq or Afghanistan. Russia is carrying out select targeted strikes aimed at disarming Ukraine. And therefore, Russia is going slow. But even with that slow pace, Russia is pretty much surrounding the capital of Ukraine. It is very reasonable of the Russian president that he has offered peace talks. Because remember, Russia does not wish to occupy Ukraine. All Russia wants is a security guarantee that Ukraine will not become part of NATO, 1. That Ukraine will not seek nuclear weapons, 2. That Ukraine will not become a puppet in the hands of the West, especially the US, and indulge in any anti-Russian activities. That's all Russia wants. Russia is not interested in holding on to any territory. And as far as these areas are concerned, they have already declared their independence, and Russia has recognized them as independent states. Russia is not even planning to planning to take over these areas. They have already been recognized as independent states. So all the Western propaganda that Russia wants to annex Ukraine or take over Ukraine, that's pure bullshit. Russia simply wishes to disarm Ukraine because Ukraine has or had become a direct threat to Russia, because the current president of Ukraine decided to become a puppet in the hands of NATO. That is the real problem. And if Ukraine denounces and gives up any ambitions of being part of NATO, this entire crisis can be over within a matter of days. Thank you. That's